phone.
Okay, welcome to the first session, session 1A, the only session, I guess, which is session 1 right now, of the conference. We have three very interesting topics, but I think more importantly, we have three very interesting scholars who have kind of gone above and beyond Call of Duty in the life of a usual scholar and put themselves out here in this way. So I actually wanted to start the panel by first introducing them, but also asking each of them why they chose their topic and what brought them to this point of discussing this. And so I think the panelists have decided their order. No, I got that wrong.
Do you prefer going first?
No.
Okay.
You want
first.
to? Yeah.
Okay, the panelists have decided their order. And so first is Kate Woodsman from New York University. And Kate, speaking into one of those little gadgets, why did you choose this topic?
Well, apart from a personal investment in asexualities and trauma studies, I think I chose it because I kept hearing a recurring narrative of the sort within, in regards to sex-positive spaces being maybe not as idyllic as they had previously seemed in queer communities. So that was my original entry. But
You'll be presenting first.
yes.
Second is, okay, Stefanos Valikas, your topic is a ghost-based narrative reclaiming Manhattan's lost waterfront. And you're from Kennesaw State University. Tell us why you chose this topic.
Well, I moved to the US about 7 years ago, and New York was my first place of residence. I did my master's there, and by living in New York, I experienced those spaces that I'm talking about in their gentrified form. And by research, I found out throughout history that these spaces were very different from how I experienced them in the 21st century. So I just go back in time and I do historical and theoretical research on them.
And Royce, you're from Northwestern University, and your presentation is, can queer people of color be carefree, engaging queer catharsis as a world-making practice in the ballroom scene? Tell us why you chose your topic.
Yeah, so actually I've been working on this and thinking about this project for a few years. It started in my undergraduate work, and I was really thinking about how queer people of color survive in a world that is seeking to inflict violence on identities. And I definitely have a very personal investment in the project because it was ethnographic work, and I have become close with so many people in the scene while I was doing it. And I think starting off the project, I was very much thinking in a very binaristic, yeah, you can survive or you can't. And I think something that I'm even coming back to it now to do this presentation, it made me think a lot about the gray space and all of that, and the fact that survival and succeeding and joy, what is the radical potentiality of all of that, and what are the ways in which some days that works out, some days it fails, and how do we employ that just to navigate dangerous spaces?
And let me introduce myself. My name is Andrew Park. I'm on the advisory committee for the Queer Studies program, and I am also on staff at the law school, and I teach human rights and sexuality there, as well as in the international development studies program here at UCLA. It's interesting that each of you emphasize a personal connection to the topic, but more interestingly, a personal connection to the space that you're discussing. And it raises the question, which may be discussed throughout the conference today: what is the relationship between the researcher and the space that they are investigating? All of you occupied that space or a part of it before doing the work. And so I think that says something about the nature of the inquiry that we're trying to pursue here, and how it comes to our attention and falls under our inquiry as researchers. So let's begin with Kate from your university. And you had a PowerPoint presentation that you no, you do.
Not anymore, because I changed it, and it's not
You're
good.
doing a presentation for them.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just a few notes before I start today for my presentation. There's a content warning in terms of individuals sharing their experiences. Yeah?
The microphone will get you there. Yes.
I was wondering if the recording part of it, so. Okay, that's much better. Thank you. So there is going to be a content warning for my work because I will be sharing experiences of asexual individuals who discuss their experiences with sexual assault and trauma. The second comment I have is that survivor as a term is vastly preferable in traumatic communities than victim, the victim narrative, but it's also been taken up as contentious recently as well. And I choose to use survivor because that's the language that the asexual folk that I discuss and theorize upon in their experiences in my essay, that's the term they use as well. So, my paper is Whose Harm Is It Anyways? Asexual Kaleidoscope Individuals Discuss Traumas Within Sex-Positive Communities. And my research lies at the intersection of queer theory, trauma studies, and asexuality studies. Asexuality scholar Anthony Bogart estimates that 1% of humanity experiences very little to no sexual attraction, and thus fall under the category asexual. And in the context of my research, queer theory refers to both theories that examine readings of text through a queer or non-normative lens, and a term to describe the study of non-heterosexual and non-normative sexualities, the norm implied being heavily subjected, of course, along with the issues of the prefix non, including all other identities, to intense scrutiny in sexuality studies. And I have sex positivity as, quote, an attitude towards human sexuality that regards all consensual sexual activities as fundamentally healthy and pleasurable, end quote, currently has a large presence in heterosexual and especially queer sexual communities. And finally, as I refer to it in my paper, most importantly, trauma describes cases of, quote, people whose experiences of great harm circulate in the vicinity of sexual, physical, emotional, psychological trauma, and who are marked by it, end quote. This individualized conceptualization of trauma was introduced by Anne Stepkovich in her book, An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Cultures. And Stepkovich proposes that a queer, non-normative reading of trauma can critique the practice of concealing traumas in lesbian and women's communities, while also allowing trauma to be productive, even if it's not progressing towards becoming non-traumatized. So my guiding research questions are, how can individual experiences of sexual trauma coexist with sex positivity and also asexual identities, especially when the latter have become unsettled by pro-asexual activist attempts to free asexuality of any association with sexual trauma in particular? And how can my findings work towards dismantling a documented societal belief that asexuals cannot experience sexual abuse and subsequent trauma if they are not allosexual? The latter is a term asexuals use to describe subjects experiencing sexual desire, and is intended to decenter sexual desire as the norm. I use Stepkovich's theory of queer trauma in my theorizing extensively to examine and also validate experiences of belonging and trauma recorded by asexuals navigating allosexual, queer, and sex-positive spaces in the present day. But thus I aim to help eliminate existing biases that portray asexuals as either only mentally ill or non-existent, and provide a means to counteract asexuals' recountings of having the reported incidents of being sexually assaulted being dismissed or understated. This disbelief in regards to asexuals' reports, combined with an increasing frequency of openly asexual individuals, mostly women, recording that they have been correctively raped in order to turn them sexual again, makes my work timely. I argue that asexual engagement with trauma do not necessarily have to reify an often recounted narrative of traumatic asexual development. Rather, these engagements can also be used productively to theorize upon and also validate experiences of both belonging and harm recorded by asexuals navigating allosexual, queer, and sex-positive spaces. I also describe how, by protesting a common societal and medicalized narrative that the once normative adolescent allosexuality was reoriented by trauma to asexuality, many asexual activists deride pathological assumptions regarding their sexuality, and they resist them as well. However, these activists must also, and they do, necessarily negate experiences of sexual trauma revealed within their own communities in order for this rejection of the asexual misorientation narrative to hold any strength and solidarity, thus forcefully bearing the stories of, as well as alienating from asexual communities, asexual individuals who suffer from after effects of sexual trauma, which include isolation, mental distress, and risk of self-harm and suicide. The double harmfulness of experiencing both exclusion and trauma was confirmed by asexuals in online forums and literary materials such as published articles or independent magazines or zines alike. And in the future, through qualitative interviews, I'm going to be examining how the current popularity of sex positivity especially within queer communities to which asexuals frequently identify with and belong, helps to shape and determine how asexuality and also trauma should manifest as and look like in the stories of asexual interviewees from around the Greater Toronto area. Through questioning sex positivity as, quote, one of the most healthy practices through which sex can be expressed, end quote, I'm able to view how norms surrounding sexual desire are upheld in many ways, even those considered to be the most progressive, and how these norms portray asexuals as immoral, unhealthy, and sexually regressive. By doing so, I want to dismantle stereotypes of who is able to experience sexual trauma through sexual violence, which, like sexual norms, are often upheld in both heterosexual and queer, allosexual-centered societies, and also sexual health care, to the detriment of asexual survivors of sexual violence. Asexuality scholars Megan Nutt, in line with Setvich's desire to expand meaning within sex positivity, proposes that the term sex neutrality could be used to fully allow for a range of sexualities to express themselves, in addition to help removing the implication of repression associated with asexuals. However, as sex neutrality has not really become yet a rival to sex positivity's influence, I think that the latter still needs to be investigated thoroughly, which I do here through his personal experiences. In Melt's essay discussing how pressure to engage sexually disrupts asexual individuals' ability to recognize and avoid trauma, one interviewee mentioned, quote, when I didn't seem to want sex in sex-positive spaces, I was given suggestions on how to process my ingrained repression, end quote. Interviewees also reported being pressured to engage in sex to prove their queerness, an experience echoed on the Asexuality Education and Visibility Network, or AVEN, forums, with asexuals reporting that they sometimes engaged in sexual activity they were encouraged to but did not want, in order for both themselves, but mostly their partners, to test if the asexual's inability to feel sexual desire was a result of unhealed trauma surrounding heterosexual sex. An unnamed co-author of the zine, quote, fucked on being sexually dysfunctional in sex-positive queer spaces, describes this experience, quote, it's really great that we're having conversations about consent now, but let's not forget that the culture we live in is inherently coercive and non-consensual. We can only really say and mean yes if we can really safely say and mean no. But even this is not enough. Sometimes when I want to say no, I still say yes. Why? Because I feel like I should. I can't imagine someone wanting to date me if I told them we were never going to have sex. So, I must fuck, at least occasionally. These are the circumstances under which I date people in heteropatriarchy. If we never fucked, it's because something's wrong with us, at least one of us. We're faulty, broken, pathologized, but we're adults. Adults fuck. We're queers. Queers fuck. Otherwise, how do you know if you're queer? Am I right? End quote. Here, pathologizing medicalized discourses of trauma, heteropatriarchal standards of sexual desire, and queer sexuality narratives of the pressure to prove oneself as queer intersect to create a really harmful situation in which the author has to navigate her sexuality under duress and emit sexual desire in order to avoid external questioning of her normalcy, queerness, and wholeness. And yet, outside of her zine, where could she have chosen to share her experiences? In asexual forums, where she might be considered through partaking in sex as not asexual enough to lay claim to the identity, which she mentioned she does not identify with fully anyway because of its exclusionary tendencies. Queer spaces, perhaps bars or classrooms or online and social media, where she might encounter resistance to the ideas that queer sex is not equally liberatory in the same ways for every person who partakes in it, and that queer sex positivity holds fissures through which non-desiring sexual subjects fall unnoticed. Or could she relate her narrative toward medical providers who might tell her how to recover from her problem and to make the most of the sexual experiences she feels obligated to engage in? According to the author, none of these spaces provide a solution to her feelings of concern and coercion, leading to her final conclusion, quote, under these circumstances, how can I say no? End quote, a sentence eerily similar to post-event traumatic narratives of sexual assault. Continuing the theme of sexual coercion found in both Melk's essay and critical zines, AVEN member Jora's forum post speaks to a disjunction between her own understanding of what it means to be truly asexual and her traumatic experience. Quote, when I was 15, I was raped by my ex. I never felt sexual attraction before the incident, nor did I have sex, but I think I was a bit too young to feel sexual attraction anyhow. I'm currently in a relationship and we have sex. Sometimes I can handle it and it'll be fine. Other times I get really disgusted and depressed. On rare occasions, sex makes me feel uncomfortable, panicky, depressed, and even suicidal. I've talked to my partner about my possible asexuality and my rape. They were somewhat understanding about both, but they also act as if it's a personal offense not to have sex to them. This makes me feel even more guilty about how I feel. And I want to be a part of this community, but I don't know if I truly belong. True asexuals know that they aren't attracted to people because that's who they are, not because of their experiences, right? Do you think I'm asexual? End quote. Little is known as to whether or not Abjora herself identifies as queer, and if her relationship with her partner is considered to be such as well, and I'm apprehensive to attribute queerness where it's not described. However, according to Svetkovich and queer trauma studies, perhaps I don't really have to if thinking queerly about individual trauma. And in theorizing queerly about trauma, Svetkovich names two categories. The first, recognizing relationships between sexual pleasure and sexual trauma, as in both should exist in sex positivity to allow space for trauma's messiness, instead of an unrealistic progressive narrative. First, she says, bringing together abuse and sex creates a sort of irony that queers understandings of what we expect ideal sexual and recently sex-positive encounters to look like. This irony can then critique how colonist, Eurocentric societies tend to sharply hierarchize one sexual relationship standard in particular over others as the most progressive ideal any subject could possibly attain. A heterosexual, loving, non-inclusive, at least on the surface, monogamous relationship, even as this utopic vision has been proven to be insidiously more unrealistic than it sounds. And this kind of questioning of what kinds of sexual societies receive societal sexualities receive positive attention and endorsement allows for sexual assault and abuse to be shown as they are, which is rampant and deadly, which can then lead to survivors' narratives being shown the validation and gravity they deserve. Secondly, Svetkovich's interpretation of queer can be used to describe the tendency to link abuse with its after effects, but without supporting the notion that changing one's object choice is the best option for healing the lingering trauma of the abuse in question. In Abjora's case, the possibility of being asexual, despite being her primary inclination since she was young, can't seem to coexist alongside her knowledge that her trauma arising from rape could have shaped her orientation. She states that true asexuals inherently know who they are. They don't doubt themselves like she does. Her sexuality, in her unwilling opinion, could have been partly shaped through the trauma of her rape, but she also can't ignore the fact that she had never felt sexual attraction or desire before her assault either. Reading Abjora's trauma narrative queerly can thus be useful in validating her experiences, as a regular reading of her trauma could, as Svetkovich mentions, suggest to her that changing her object choice to one of a tolerant, allosexual partner might heal her trauma, as opposed to the very real possibility of Abjora perhaps never getting over it. A non-queer reading of Abjora's trauma also doesn't take into account the layering of her fresh trauma from sexual coercion over her prior trauma from rape, a messy, non-regressive situation that has made her doubt her place on even forums and her worth as someone who cannot provide her partner's emotional and sexual needs. Had Abjora ever been aware before posting in the Avon forum that her accounts of past sexual trauma could actually exist alongside her asexuality, she may have been able to avoid self-doubt and to embrace the label of asexual earlier, if she so desired, leading to a greater sense of self-knowledge and confidence in her identity, and perhaps subsequently an ability to refuse a partner who would prey upon her guilt in order to coerce her into providing sexual acts. Abjora's fresh trauma, the result of rejection and self-guilt of being made to feel not enough to fulfill her partner's sexual needs, might have been avoided. Abjora's experiences weren't unusual on the Avon forums. Other Avon members validated her post and reported feeling traumatized and shameful while engaging with their partners sexually, even if the members could not identify the feeling of coercion's origins when it didn't come from their partner. Some queer asexuals mentioned that they did so to fit in and to attempt to heal from their past experiences. After all, they live in a society where most trauma narratives demand that they do so in order to be fully whole. In addition to the taboo of lingering in one's own trauma, that good, happy queer is expected to always be in the process of becoming increasingly sexually enlightened through sex positivity, something many queer Avon commenters found impossible. Overall, many Avon forum members consider themselves to be in the process of continually accumulating trauma sexually through not only their discomfort with sex, but their uncertainty in allowing their past traumas to reside alongside their asexual identity, the result of asexual efforts to distance sexual trauma from asexual identity completely. And in conclusion, for queer asexuals, an internalization of their own inability to provide a critical aspect of what is assumed to keep queer relationships together brought them both shame and anguish. As discussed previously, both queerness and heterosexuality have historically and presently been represented as synonymous with sexual desire. In addition, the existence of queer sexuality in particular is often seen as an inherently political resistance against hegemonic and oppressive heteronormativity, and it might even have the potential to create a desirably queer planet, as Warner says. However, for asexuals who realize that an assumption of sexuality alone, being able to enact resistance against societal oppressions is incomplete, the possibilities of an eventual sex neutrality to accommodate asexualities in diverse communities and even validate asexuals living with trauma are limitless. Thank you.
Thank you. And while Stefanos is setting up, have I syllabicated your name correctly? Stefanos. Of course, I got it wrong. Thanks. All of these have a theme, one of which I think is, as we create a world that we want to create, and in the United States, one of the questions is, has the LGBT movement, for instance, walked away from sexuality? And how do communities within it, the leather community, kink community, people that enjoy multiple partners, or stranger sex, or other kinds of things that aren't part of the official policy agenda, do we have a place in this space? One of the responses is to bring back more sex positivity, and your paper gives a very interesting critique of how that is possible, beneficial, detrimental, and I think we're going to hear that from everybody. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So take it away.
In recent years, the term queer space has been consistently used as an elaborate reference in the study of queer sexualities within the context of the separate zones, physical spaces, urban settings, and social geographical locations that they once did or still occupy. Therefore, queer spaces may be said to reflect concerns with inclusivity or exclusion, public and private discourses, desire and identity, sameness and difference, and how such perceived relationships permeate, traverse, or transgress queer sexual practices. These concerns are traditionally addressed in the field of queer theory and beyond, often including interdisciplinary approaches and standpoints from a variety of critical positions. Indeed, the scholarship exploring sexuality and space expands widely, highlighting questions of identity and difference, body and territory, and the politics of community building, all of which intersect into the most visible manifestations of space, either queer or non-queer. Designated neighborhoods, usually referred to as gayborhoods or gay ghettos, and red light districts with residential, commercial, and entertainment sectors. Similarly, I argue for the need to theorize queer space not through the exclusive application of queer theory, but rather through the examination of visual imagery to illuminate queer experiences of intimacy and the violation of dominant norms and mores. Within this schematic, I propose a bold rereading of what José Esteban Muñoz called an archive of the ephemeral, a pragmatic call for a return to the past, essentially to the material contexts of marginalized spaces where desire and abjection converged. My scope focuses on the pleasures and dangers of New York City in the 1970s and 1980s, as captured by itinerant photographers such as Leonard Fink, Alvin Baltrop, and Peter Hujar, who documented the decayed vacant piers along Manhattan's West Side waterfront and their appropriation by disenfranchised bodies who used them for refuge, habitation, and play. By using photographs as primary objects of thought, I aim to delve into the vestiges of a lost civilization, the a priori ownership of sex as liberation and pleasure, and the architectural and geographical circumstances that enabled the emergence of queer space on the fringes of the city. Gordon Brent Ingram acknowledges the layered and often contradictory social transactions related to queer communality, love, and sex that involve and are between sides. These transactions, I argue, are rarely fixed patterns of queer sociability, but rather fluid, complex, and varied manifestations of bodily connections, affirming the positive and liberating value of sexual spatialization. Ingram demarcates queer sites as part of a larger queer scape, which he defines as, quote, a landscape of erotic alienations, ones that shift with demographics, social development, political economies, interventions of the state, aesthetics, and desire. I'm going to play you now a video while I continue reading my paper. And it's this one, which kind of like shows how the West Side New York piers used to be like in the 70s. Queerscapes, in other words, can consist of multiple spatial formations, social and sexual relations or ambiguous and amorphous boundaries, enabling participants to move back and forth between queer and non-queer spaces. In the post-Stonewall era of gay liberation, New York had become the quintessential queerscape, facilitating a multitude of spaces for the lesbian, gay, and transsexual experience. On an aggrandized scale, these included quarters, streets, and buildings. On a more specific scale, the production of queer spaces materialized in bars, parks, and cruising areas, tea rooms, clubs, societies, bookstores, Broadway theaters, and sex movie houses, bathhouses, and vacant trucks. On the Lower West Side of Manhattan, where now lies a carefully landscaped park running along the Hudson River, once stood gargantuan cavernous terminals that used to serve the stately ocean liners during the heyday of transatlantic travel. After the decline of the shipping industry in the late 1950s, the Port of New York gradually moved from Manhattan to adjacent New Jersey, and these immense structures were quickly abandoned and fell into disuse and decay. And the video is showing how the piers used to be a locale of sociability between the queer population after the decline of the Port of New York. Soon the once vibrant harbor was reduced to miles of aging and dilapidated piers, unveiling the structural remnants of the waterfront to multiple subcultural and sexual appropriations. Gay men, sex workers, transvestites, juvenile runaways, drug users, and the homeless occupied the site during those years of abandonment, transforming the piers into utopias of corporeal expression free of society and the law. The main argument of this essay is not to represent these structures as utopic alternatives to conventional ways of sexual interaction, neither dismissing the utopian dimension that certainly materialized on the edge of the city, but rather to utilize them as paradigmatic forms of queer space and investigate the ways in which certain spatial and sexual conditions coalesced into a seminal moment. I'm not suggesting a cause-effect relationship either, because queer spaces, subcultures, and their networks had existed long before Stonewall. I do claim, however, that what emerged in the 1970s was a truly defiant, inherently proud pursuit of pleasure, and that it was primarily a post-Stonewall phenomenon. It is through this visibility still extant in public memory that we may now consider New York's waterfront as a paradigm for queer space, allowing us to recontextualize old, often underappreciated narratives. In his memoir, The Motion of Light and Water, Samuel Delany recounts his own experiences at the piers during the 1960s, referring to them as a place of libidinal saturation, impossible to describe to someone who has not known it. Delany describes explicitly the numberless silent sexual acts that occurred in and around the docks. 35, 50, 100, all but strangers, hugely ordered, highly social, attentive, silent, and grounded in a certain care, if not community. At those times, within those one-walled alleys, now between the trucks, now in the back of open loaders, cock passed from mouth to hand to us to mouth, without ever breaking contact with other flesh for more than seconds. Mouth, hand, ass passed over whatever you held out to them. Mouth, rectum, another cock required moving the head, hip, the hand, no more than an inch, 3 inches. It was engrossing, it was exhausting, it was reassuring, and it was very human. Now, the writer's exposure to gay mass sex provides the appropriate context for examining the sexual ethos of these spaces as a collective, authentic, lived experience. José Esteban Muñoz emphasizes this section by indicating, quote, how the men in this space took care of one another, not only by offering flesh, but by performing a care for the self, that encompassed a vast care for others, end of quote. The sequence of gestures that Delany so vividly remembers, this sexual attention that passes from one man to the other, constantly repeating and multiplying, conveys the transitivity of care that Munoz suggests, but also prompts us to think of stigmatized sexual practices as performances of a richer democracy. Dennis Altman, too, underscores the anonymous sexual camaraderie that he witnessed at the bathhouses, and he described it as a sort of Whitmanesque democracy, a desire to know and trust other men in a type of brotherhood far removed from the male bonding of rank, hierarchy, and competition that characterizes much of the outside world. This concept, however, is contested by Leo Bersani, claiming that sexualized spaces, such as the bathhouses, can be ruthlessly ranked, hierarchized, and competitive environments. But we should not ignore that in the wake of gay liberation, sex became the catalyst of constructing a sense of belonging, which, although concealed and admittedly confined in the margins of society, was nevertheless essential to the appropriation of urban space. Now, clearly, the sexual circumstances referenced above are not static formations of queer corporeality, but changeable and adaptable to societal and economic developments. The difference between Delany's libidinal recollections in the mid-60s and the years after Stonewall, at least as it is commonly understood in public memory, lies in the more established character of sex and space. The idea of an unfettered sexual landscape, which is so easily extrapolated by the accounts of those who cruised and had sex in the piers, often overlooks the parallel threat of violence and the dangers that lurk in there, thereby inhibiting a more expansive view or even considering the waterfront as a locus of objection. Rather than proposing such a nostalgic vision, Douglas Crimp reminds us, quote, the sad fates of teenagers who lived there because their parents had kicked them out after discovering they were gay. The terror of psychopaths preying on vulnerable men and sometimes killing them. The constant danger, especially at night, even the risk of falling through a rotten floorboard or stepping on a rusty nail. End of quote. Such a reminder highlights an important dimension of meaning, our geographically and chronologically distant connection. Crimp looks at photographic practices to validate, in some ways, a more direct contact with the past. In an article from 2008 in Art Forum magazine, he focuses on the piers and the photographs of Alvin Balthrop, an unknown African-American photographer who documented in a vast body of images all manner of illicit activity within the labyrinthine structures. While Balthrop's photographs certainly give rise to a voyeuristic desire that moves beyond the boundaries of time and space, his adventurous forays into the crumbling structures encompassed a serious dynamic between marginality and erotic alienation, giving us unmediated access to the queer spaces of the past. Balthrop wrote a few months before his death in 2004. Although initially terrified of the piers, I began to take these photos as a voyeur and soon grew determined to preserve the frightening, mad, unbelievable, violent, and beautiful things that were going on at that time. To get certain shots, I hung from the ceilings of several warehouses utilizing a makeshift harness, watching and waiting for hours to record the lives that these people led and the unfortunate ends that they sometimes met. The rapid emergence and expansion of AIDS in the 1980s further reduced the number of people going to and living at the piers and the sporadic joys that could be found there. In The Age of AIDS, photographer Peter Hujar depicted the urban emptiness in and around the waterfront, capturing the run-down structures, vacant lots, and desolate industrial areas during the night. The images differ significantly from earlier taken photographs during the public socio-sexual culture of the 1970s, as well as from those taken by Balthrop at the same locations. For Crimp, these pictures are cruising pictures, but with no people in them. In one of the images, we witness the infinite perspective of a long, crumbled hallway, scattered pieces of paper, rubble, and other debris, covering the narrow floor, windowless, fire scored to walls, extending all the way to the vanishing point, collapsed parts of the roof, revealing fragmented bits of the sky, like to intentionally disclose a labyrinth of doors, rooms, and more hallways. In another death-saturated image, an oversized portrait is accompanied with a disruptive inscription that reads, "If only I could spit up blood." Here, the writing indicates that by 1983, the AIDS crisis had already reached not only our lives, but our spaces too. The eventual demolition of the piers and the social and spatial redevelopment of the city would soon be realized under the capitalist vision of Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. By the late 1990s, the West Side waterfront, Times Square, and other areas of New York's queerscape had largely disappeared, giving their place to new, sanitized, desexualized versions of space. The impact of these transformations was profound, changing previously claimed geographies, altering significantly the meaning of marginality and alienation. AIDS, too, was used by both the dominant homophobic rhetoric and the logic of gentrification. As Delany points out, quote, "The threat from AIDS produced a 1985 health ordinance that began the shutdown of the specifically gay sexual outlets," end of quote, making clear to queer citizens that public policy was to claim their spaces back. In his landmark essay, Mourning and Militancy, Douglas Crimp argues that alongside the dismal toll of death, what many of us have lost is a culture of sexual possibility. Backrooms, tea rooms, movie houses, and baths, the trucks, the piers, the rumble of the dunes. Sex was everywhere for us, and everything we wanted to venture, golden showers and water sports, cocksucking and ringing, fucking and fist-fucking. Today, the reception of the piers in discussing New York's queer history is both neglected and under-theorized, pushed aside by the mainstream culture. While lost queer spaces can be reclaimed through photographs, fictional or personal accounts, through queer theory and its investment in contextualizing queer history and culture, we need to direct our efforts not only into recollection, but to a collective and collaborative assessment of the interpretation strategies that will help us better situate the study of queer spaces within the larger discourse of sexuality and identity. Thank you.
While Gervais Marsh is setting up, it's interesting that your paper talks about the healing nature of sexualized spaces, but also their danger. There was reference to the competitiveness of a bathhouse and danger of violence. And I think Gervais's presentation delves a little deeper into the particular process that happens between an individual seeking healing powers of a space and how that space can provide it. So let me just have you give your presentation. And we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards. So.
Yeah. I definitely want it to be a conversation, I think. Like I said before, returning to this presentation and thinking about it again, I realized just how much gray space there is in thinking about conceptions of queer joy and what the potential queer joy has as an act of survival, an act of liberation. So I actually changed the title of the presentation very last minute. So the presentation is called Radical Potentiality of Queer Joy, Queer Catharsis and Construction of Counter-Public Space Within the Ballroom Scene. And I think it's really important to frame the conversation before we even get into the actual paper, and thinking about what it means to be a queer person of color living in our society that doesn't recognize their subjectivity, and what the stakes are for people who identify as queer people of color. So 39% of African American men who are diagnosed with HIV were aged 13 to 24 in 2014. And in a lot of research done on homeless LGBTQ youth, 42% identifies as racial minority. And I think it's also important for us to think about organizing from the margins, right? So who are the folks who exist on the margins or who are dealing with these systems of domination at their highest, right? So I think it's really important for us to uplift the voices of trans women of color in the first 8 months of 2016, 19 transgender people have been killed, and it's been overwhelmingly Black transgender women, right? So I think a conversation that is not lifting up those voices and those lives is also impacting a certain kind of violence. So I really want to center those in the presentation. My ethnographic research took place in the house and ballroom scene, both in Los Angeles and in New York, over 2 years. And in thinking about the ballroom community, I want to think about it through the performance of self-representation in the various categories, the epistemologies that grow out of the scene, and also this re-articulation of notions of home and family. So I wanted to also place this understanding of queer joy in conversation with this movement around centering Black joy, particularly among youth, but Black joy in general. And really often right now we're seeing a flooding of the media with recordings of violence that has always been impacting the Black community, but which is now being recorded. And what does it mean to center Black joy in contrast to that? Jamila Johns in a Refinery 29 article notes, by putting the word carefree front and center, it's making a statement that we do not want to solely be defined by hardships and stereotypes, so we can enjoy our lives as we please. And then Danielle Young, in kind of elaborating on this Black girl magic, carefree Black girl movement, and talking about the hashtag Black boy joy, says, Black men are dying at the hands of authority figures, and witnessing Black boy joy is a rare, much needed break from the tragic headlines and hashtags. And I wanted to put that in conversation with the precarity of being a person of color within the ballroom scene. So thinking about the fact that most of the folks in the ballroom scene are low-income youth of color, many have strained relationships with their biological families, many face homelessness, excessive drug use, and very high rates of HIV/AIDS. And also just thinking about the competitive nature of being in the ballroom scene, I think it's important to not think of the scene as this fantasy world where people get to live out glamorous lives and compete and become family and build this community. I think all those things happen, but it also needs to be juxtaposed with the reality that it's a very competitive scene. There's a lot of emotional trauma within that space. And youth are often involved in a lot of illicit activities. So crafting, which is a form of credit card fraud, which youth often employ to buy outfits and accessories, to participate in balls or just to survive and make it from day to day. So a very, very brief historical framework of the ballroom scene. It's an underground subculture group made up of queer people of color and predominantly Black and Latino men. The documentation first began in the 1930s during the Harlem Renaissance, and then modern representations of the scene came about in the 1970s, and I'm sure most people know Jenny Livingston's film Paris is Burning and its representation of the house and ballroom scene, which has its own problematic history with us. Another question. The scene evolved and started to include competitions that involved runway walking and the dance style known as voguing. And it's also structured around a house system. So each house is defined as a unit of people who band together under a house mother or father and who compete in the balls as a group. And a lot of the houses are named after fashion houses, so like House of Givenchy, for example. The house is not a physical structure, although ballroom kids often do live together, but it's not seen as a specific physical structure, but it's more about the social reality that constructs their community as a space of home. And the house parents lead the house, facilitate house meetings, and they often do provide financial and emotional support, which I think also, going back to this idea that it's not a fantasy world, I think there are power dynamics that are in play whenever one particular person is providing financial support, emotional support for another person, right? So, some of my grounding theories are thinking about Jose Munoz, like Stefanos, and his ideas of disidentifications. And to disidentify is to draw from and engage with dominant representations, ideologies, and subjectivities in order to move through a world that refuses to acknowledge the minoritarian subject. And I think about the relationship between disidentifications and world-making as a practice, and how do folks within the ballroom scene create alternative spaces, create alternative worlds. And Munoz talks about world-making as delineating the ways in which performances, both theatrical and everyday rituals, have the ability to establish alternate views of the world that are oppositional ideologies that function as critiques of oppressive regimes of truth that subjugate minoritarian people. And then I think E. Patrick's essay on queer studies has resonated with me for a while. I think both personally as someone who doesn't necessarily finds it difficult to find myself in Western queer studies frameworks, and also just thinking about intersectional identities of queer people of color. And a quote from the essay says, "I used to answer to queer, but when I was hailed by that naming, interpolated in that moment, I felt as if I was being called out of my name. I needed something with more soul, more bang, something closer to home. It is my name after all, right? Annie Patrick talks about this idea of queer as a way that his grandmother, who is a poor black woman who lives in the South, and when she says queer, she says queer. And he says that she's homophobic, but she also, as a poor black woman in the South, exists on the margins of a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal society that also seeks to elide her own identity. And so when thinking about a queer politic, how do we include all those who are on the margins and not just focusing on sexual or gender identity, right? So one of the points that I bring up throughout the presentation is this idea of a queer catharsis. And it actually came up during one of my interviews with an interviewee, Robert. And he was just talking about the affect of being in the ballroom space, walking at a ball. And he talked about it being a very cathartic experience. And that really struck me in thinking about what does it mean to have these cathartic moments? What does it mean to have that moment of release? What does it mean to experience that moment of joy, even if it's a momentary moment, right? How does that play a role in constructing the community of the ballroom scene? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines catharsis as the act or process of releasing a strong emotion, such as pity or fear, especially by expressing it in an art form. And so how can we think of this release as a coping mechanism, right? To deal with a trauma that inflicts queer people. It's also important to think about the ball as a site of ritual and how that ritual constructs the site of the ballroom and the physical and emotional responses that take place walking in a ball as we understand it as a counterpublic space. So I've been thinking a lot about realness and the role of performing realness in order to access these moments of queer catharsis. Marlon Bailey, who is one of the few scholars really doing in-depth work within the house and ballroom scene, in-depth ethnographic work, defines realness as a set of performance criteria, a strategy that requires adherence to certain performances, self-presentations, and embodiments that are believed to capture the authenticity of particular gender and sexual identities. So what does it mean to draw from my majoritarian representations of gender, sex, race, and reconfigure and rework those in ways to find yourself legible in a society that does not want to find your identity legible, right? And then there are also states of realness. So it's not as simple as, oh, I'm gonna draw from these different states and I'm gonna recreate myself, and that's it. There are very high stakes for realness, and I think this goes back to the idea that queer people are constantly negotiating different forms of violence. So one of my interviewees, Robert, also noted, what does it mean for a trans woman to be rejected in every space of society, but come into a ball and have a whole ballroom stand at their feet? There is no other place in the world where they can get that kind of adulation. And so performance of the ball becomes a counter-narrative to the abomination, a counter-narrative to transphobia, and structural racism and classism. So I think in that quote we really see that there's a labor to performing realness, and it's a constant labor. So it's more than just dressing up. It could involve surgery, hormones, and also inhabiting precise gender mannerisms. And I think particularly for trans women of color, to perform realness, the stakes are even increasingly high because often this performance needs to translate from the ballroom scene to outside society. So I've also been thinking a lot about the role of being young within the scene and what the role of the Kiki scene within the larger ballroom community, and this idea of getting your life. And what does it mean to get your life? I think it's kind of transitioned into more mainstream culture, this idea of, oh, I'm gonna get my life. This outfit is giving me life, this performance gave me life. But I think we need to really center in this idea of what does it mean to get your life for 30 minutes per hour to make it through the rest of the day when you are negotiating all these different violent spaces. So another interviewee who has been a house mother for a number of different houses, Elaine, noted when talking about the Kiki scene, not only are they having fun and being able to be themselves and express an art form, but they're also able to talk about safer sex. So how does the Kiki scene provide that space for young queer people, but also give them space to talk about the real threats that are affecting their lives? She also talks about it as a form of solidarity among younger queer folk. And she says they have people that are their age, that look like them, that are going through some of the same struggles as them. And then another interviewee, Martin, elaborates on that and the role of getting life for a young queer person in noting, take the very feminine boy who is always being harassed, and then he comes into the community, and the very thing he gets teased about, he gets life. He performs in both femme or drag, and he gets life for it. To some degree, it becomes cathartic. So I want to think about these cathartic moments as not just metaphorically getting your life, but also literally giving life to queer subjects, and as serving as a form of healing from daily trauma, and trauma that has been compounded over years. Robert also goes on to highlight this idea of mattering, and he says, there comes with it a feeling of mattering when everybody told you something different. So what is the potential of mattering? What does it mean to have someone tell you that you matter? In thinking about this idea of queer catharsis connected to a form of healing, I turn to Joseph Roach's work around the effigy. And he defines the effigy as a crudely fabricated image of a person, commonly one that is destroyed at his or her speed, as in hanging or burning in effigy. And he talks about the effigy as a totem, so a form of storage of a particular person. And I also want to think about the effigy as perhaps storing a particular self, a particular persona, a self that you necessarily cannot enact in your daily life for fear of violence. He says effigy similarity to performance should be clear enough. It fills by means of surrogation a vacancy created by the absence of an original. So how do we negotiate that absence in daily life when we have to store certain parts of ourselves? For ballroom kids, perhaps the effigy is represented by that persona that they inhabit when they're on stage, when they're performing, when they're just attending a ball or a ball meeting or having a kiki. And how does this performance facilitate a tribute to that other persona and a cathartic moment of self-representation? I also turn to M. Jackie Alexander's work around the relationship between the body and experiences of trauma. And her work is talking specifically about the slave body, but I want to expand that in thinking about queer people. And one thing she notes is, I had surmised that cosmological systems house memory, and that such memory is necessary to distill the psychic traumas produced under the grotesque conditions of slavery. So thinking about how queer people handle this trauma, how we store this trauma, how we figure out ways to negotiate daily life while also dealing with that trauma. She then goes on to say, to know the body is to know it as a medium for the divine, living a purpose that exceeds the imperatives of the plantation. And I'm thinking of expanding ideas of plantation to a white supremacist heteronormative society that is bent on not allowing the queer subject to exist. So perhaps the identities of queer people are just too excessive, or just too great, or just too powerful to be contained within this space. And so they need to create alternate worlds, such as the ballroom scene, in order to have those moments to express themselves. Like I said, I think it's really important to think about liminality in the ballroom scene, and that things don't always work, things don't always succeed. Survival is not. Survival is an ongoing day-to-day process. And so because it is a side of ritual, sometimes the rituals don't always have the same effect, right? Queer catharsis cannot be thought of just this one-time moment, but it could also be a layering of experiences. So it could be you performing at balls for 5 years, always getting chopped, and then finally you make it and you win the particular category, right? So how do you negotiate those feelings of feeling like you didn't matter in all those moments to getting to that point? And I think with this idea of getting your life at a ball, there's also this addictive feeling. So when you do get that adulation, when you do get that praise, and when that's the only space in which you get that praise, what stakes do you go to work to kind of reproduce that? Another one of my interviewees, Blondie, noted. So my first ball, I did the Pink Panther, and I jumped off this balcony, and it was awesome. And everyone stood up and started cheering, which was great. I feel like balls are my way. That first experience was my way of saying to myself that I could do it. I feel like Beyonce with her alter ego, because I feel like I'm a celebrity. So to what lengths do people go to reproduce that feeling of celebrity? Like I've been bringing up throughout the presentation, the ballroom scene is not a fantasy. So there is very intense competition within the scene as people strive to be the next star. Just like any form of competition, there's only space for so few people to succeed. And there is a lot of shaming that goes on with the scene when someone performs, and people generally don't like the performance. There's a lot of competition between different houses. Houses often get into arguments because they think that someone won because of bias. So there are all these different sets of drama that happen within the scene. And the ballroom community does subvert notions of gender, sexuality, notion of family, but it also reproduces them in other ways. And I think we need to think about it as not just, oh, this is a complete alternative or separate space from the white, from this heteropatriarchal society that we live in, but that those ideas definitely seep into the ballroom scene as well. Final thoughts. So I think it was important for me to situate the analysis of queer catharsis within this larger discussion about precarity of the lives of Black people. To highlight that the ballroom scene is also not a fantasy world, where members play pretend and becoming gross with a desire to live out their celebrity dreams. And I think one of the critiques of the carefree Black girl, Black boy joy movement is the idea that who has the privilege to be carefree, who has the privilege to represent their Black boy joy. So thinking about it not as I'm just gonna be carefree forever, or I'm not gonna exist in that space, but thinking about it as a day-to-day. And what does carefree mean to you, and how do you re-articulate carefree? How do you re-articulate joy for yourself, for your own survival? So like I said, the ballroom scene is a very nuanced site, and experiences vary are often influenced by the same systems of domination that affect their outside lives. But it is a community, and it represents a space that serves as a place of home, that serves as a home and a place of belonging for so many of its members. And I think the thing that I grappled with so much while doing this work is there's no binary between success and failure and survival and not surviving. And it's a constant gray space. And I think that's a gray space that queer people of color exist in because they navigate so many different communities. And thinking about intersectional identities, there's so much gray space between all of that.
Can I start with questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, come and sit down. And we'll come to you. You mentioned the solidarity that you observed, and thank you for the interview of, I think it was Richard? Robert.
I mean, they're all made up names, so it could be Richard.
Yeah, okay. Nevertheless, that sounded like a very interesting process, and Robert sounds like a great person to listen to. So there's solidarity, there's a community. You never quite got to the point, or maybe you did, but it wasn't following well enough, where you said participation in a ballroom is itself an identity. So there are ballroom kids, but that seemed to be an identity that was a label that other people would place on somebody. Mm-hmm. So do people that you interviewed feel that they had an identity as a participant, and did that identity extend outside the scene?
Yeah, so I think ballroom kids is a term that people use within the scene. So they refer to themselves as kids, and I think it goes back to this idea of the familial structure of the house system. So there's a house mother and a house father, you can have house grandparents, and then people in the scene who are not house parents can sometimes refer to themselves as kids, and they refer to themselves as siblings. I don't even know if I'm speaking into this. But can everyone hear me, generally? Yeah. So people refer to each other as siblings, and it has nothing to do with age. You can be a ballroom kid and be 50 years old. Your house mother could be 25. It's about the experience you've had within the scene, and it's also about particular traits that you may bring to the scene. And I think what was interesting for me in doing the ethnographic work was spending time with people who are in the ballroom scene, but also at their places of employment and just in their daily lives, and seeing how they navigate those spaces and how they transition. And there's just certain stark ways in which they navigate those spaces very differently. I think even just down to the mannerisms of how they walk, of how they move their hands, of how they talk. And so I think for some of them, they have the privilege of being able to extend those identities outside of the scene. But I think for most of them who are working in jobs that don't necessarily think about queer identity and queer politics, they have to very much remake and reform how they engage with those spaces. But I also think that that's not just for people who are queer people of color. I think it's something that we all have to deal with. How do we negotiate and how do we modify our identities as we move from space to space?
Questions? I can't see anything. Yeah.
So this is for the first presenter. So I want to ask this just first to make sure that I understood what you were saying. So the participants, I guess from how I understood, they understood like to be a good queer is to be sexual.
That's more of, I think that was a theory I kind of abstracted a bit from Sarah Ahmed's idea of happiness and the being a kind of neutral site of chance, bringing it back to that kind of the very root of the word. So the participants themselves didn't necessarily refer as such. That's more of my own theorizing around it as well, but it is kind of like, I would argue that it's seen in the examples of the AVEN forums that I frequented as well, in terms of that general feeling of, to progress from being traumatized to non-traumatized, is of course progress to happiness, and to progress to being, from non-sexual to sexual is the same deal, like it's associated with the same, right? That's kind of the assumption of the pathological asexual narrative. So there was kind of, in terms of the good, happy queer, where queerness is so often associated with sexuality and, radical sexuality, that kind of comes together to produce the good, happy queer, and I use kind of Amlin for that in affect theory in that way. Yeah. Does that help a little? Or
It does. Maybe like later.
yeah.
We're done once everything.
Sure. I'd love to.
All the way in the back.
Hi. My question is for Therese. I particularly appreciate the way that you describe the ball scene as not a fantasy, right? So, and what you're balancing there, which I think is particularly important, is that these spaces are not free from like the kind of I think you were talking about like white supremacist influences, right? These other negative things. I mean, we could also add to that like capitalism, not that that's separate from white supremacy, but like there's also like walls are very expensive, right?
Yeah.
And like putting together all those gigs is very expensive. Is there a way, like, so two questions. One is within the populations that you were interviewing, did they have a counter discourse to that kind of what you were talking about, the shaming, right? So that it's like it's not liberatory for everyone because it is a fundamentally competitive space. Right? So is there a counter discourse to say like, hey, maybe the space should be a little bit more like open to difference?
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, it's like how do we think about these kind of liberatory queer places, right? And like Munoz's disidentifications really gets at the fact that you can't extricate those two things from one another. But then I'm thinking to jump to another Munoz, which would be Cruising Utopia, right? Is this the idea that we could have a purely liberatory space, just something that's kind of floating for us on the horizon, right? Like something that we can't actually realize, but maybe that we attempt always unsuccessfully to enact in queer space.
Mm-hmm. So the first question was around the shaming and what is like a counter narrative to the competition within the ballroom scene. I think somewhere where I saw that counter narrative came from the relation between elders and younger folks within the scene, because I think the elders who have been through so much would kind of ground the space. And at balls, at the beginning of balls, all the elders who are present always walk the runway first, and they get applause and they get praise. And I think it's important for them to let the younger folks know, hey, we've been through it all. Like, we have been to hell and back. And for us, the ballroom scene, first and foremost, was a site of community and a site to build family. And I think talking to some of the younger folks, a lot of the discussion was, oh, the ballroom scene isn't like it used to be. The ballroom scene is not like it used to be in the 80s, not like it used to be in the 90s. It's now so competitive, people are just trying to make it into show business and whatever, through whatever channel. And so I think there was that balance, and also this hesitancy to always listen to the elders. Oh, the elders are trying to recreate a space that no longer exists. So I think that was an interesting discourse of the elders trying to ground the space and younger folks realizing that a space has changed, but also not necessarily pushing back against that. And I think something that for me, I didn't have a chance to really get into in the presentation is just how intense the misogyny is within the space, particularly towards trans women of color. And there's this like dual notion of, oh, these are the most celebrated figures in this space, but also the expectations for them are so, so, so high. And I think if ever I saw shaming, it really came through those performances. And then the second question was about,
like just kind of how can we make those spaces more utopian, right? Like is that, can we open those spaces up in a way that there isn't a kind of shame politics? So I like what you're saying about this intergenerational discussion that's happening.
yeah, I mean, can we make it a more utopic space? Like Munoz has always been so instrumental for me in just thinking about survival, but I think something I really got from talking to folks in the ballroom scene is this idea. I have one friend in particular who would always talk to me about how he just wants a house in upstate New York and he wants a family. And that's it. Like, that's what he wants when he's 40. And this idea of each person having a particular dream, and for some of them, these dreams are probably never gonna come true. But it's this idea of, I need to hold on to this dream in order to make it from day to day. It's like, this is something that I'm working towards, right? And I think for me, that was one way of thinking of it as a utopic space. But I think also just like being very frank and honest about the politics that happen within the ballroom scene. And I think there's the idea that like, oh, on this night we need to pretend like everything's okay in the world. And the politics always come up. There's always some kind of fight in the background. Something always happens. And I think just being frank and bringing those to the forefront and kind of continuously recentering it as, well, we're here as a community, we're here to support each other. How do we deal with these politics front and center?
Others? The notion of reminiscence connects both of your work, and once we engage in that reminiscence, what do we do then? You didn't focus as much in your presentation, but you talked about the notion that of the younger folks that, oh, they're just trying to bring back a scene that doesn't exist and can't exist, and maybe we don't even want that now at the moment. But it was a scene that had tremendous benefits. Same here. What now?
Well, what now? It's, the scene is totally different. It has changed dramatically. In my research, part of my research is the spaces as they exist now, and gentrification, of course, changed those spaces tremendously, and the demographics of those spaces. It's just, because I lived in New York and I visited those spaces, my experience of queer space in the waterfront is very different from Samuel Delaney's experience at the waterfront. So I started thinking, what really instigated the sexual culture that had to exist to such an extreme degree on the fringes of the city, like towards the water, where nobody could see other than, and nobody could experience other than those participants. And suddenly, when New York in the 1990s got out of its bankrupt state and neoliberal policies created a totally different environment in New York, and privatization of the Greenwich Village and the waterfront changed it completely. They built luxury condos, and the new residents of the gentrified landscape raised questions of safety. But safety is a concept that differs tremendously according to the social category that you find yourself in. So safety was different for the mainstream LGBT movement. It is different for the queer youth of color that was living in the piers, and it is totally different from the new residents of the waterfront, who are people who can afford those luxury condos. So the connection between now and then is really important for me, because I see how urban space is being defined based on the demographics and the priorities that it's of those populations set into place. So.
I also noticed that you used images as a way of mapping the space. The first set of images you showed, there were black people in the background, but the subjects were white, until the photographer who you identified as an African-American photographer
Correct.
How does using images affect the ability to look at race and what's happening?
Oh, I find images as they offer us an unmediated access to those bygone spaces, and I'm fascinated by the idea of the archive of the ephemeral that Munoz has described. Is this I mean, many scholars used the idea of the archive, and what constitutes the archive is still in question for many scholars. And I see those images as vehicles where I can approximate those spaces, not just through the images themselves as objects of critical analysis, but also to theorize, for example, graffiti. Graffiti is very important as an ephemeral object for me. Other scenes or objects that you can find inside the images. So the images are important because they offer me this access to spaces that no longer exist. And just as Katie was saying about the archive of feelings of Anna Svetkovich, Svetkovich is using a different form of archive, which I find, if not more informative, as a way to theorize or historicize certain situations. So the same thing with me. I'm using images to theorize and historicize. It's a combination between historiography and theorization of those bygone spaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any of you can.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I think what you brought up with the black people being in the background of the picture, that's something that I was thinking about. Because there's this narrative of, places like the Christopher Street Pier and bathhouses and like these different public spaces as being these liberatory spaces for particular sexual politics, but I also think about the racial politics of these spaces. I don't know, talking to folks in the ballroom scene who were a bit older, just talking about not necessarily feeling desired in those spaces that are potentially liberating for all bodies and different sexualities, but what are the racial politics that go into all of that?
Absolutely. That's why we have organizations like FEARS that try to defend the right of space for queer youth of color, because they were particularly targeted, and transgender women of color, after gentrification took place at the waterfront. And they were seen as a threat. They were seen as a threat for violence and disruption of their space. And what is Christina Henhard is arguing in her book Safe Space is that the mainstream LGBT movement either remained indifferent to this thing, or they actually supported claims of safety that was so strikingly similar to the new residents of the waterfront. So basically, the mainstream LGBT movement consists of middle-class, affluent people who can live now in the gentrified Greenwich Village, and they are primarily white. So the race issue is very important into how urban planning and urban redevelopment targets specific racial and class categories. Although they were particularly people who made the queer history of the waterfront.
We have time for a couple more questions. Kate, can I ask, there's a form of sex positivity that excludes asexuality. Can you articulate sex positivity that does not?
Yes. This is actually a question I kind of expected to be asked, absolutely, after my presentation. Just based on my experience of listening to so many asexual Kaleidoscope folks and also reading online forum posts regarding sex positivity as a beneficial, of course, practice. And what I found was so many asexuals themselves were actually tripping over themselves to also recognize, of course, that sex positivity, has its great benefits and that it's, a very liberatory practice for many. But I still feel this way. So there is still a hesitancy to admit, feelings within this larger narrative. So the sex positivity that you're referring to, right, assumes and respects everyone's, desire for it, focus on the consensual aspect of things, right? So the right to not be pressured in regards to if you, want to abstain or do not experience desire. The issue with the two sex positivities, I think, is that according to language and power and how they inform each other, they're called by the same name. And so for me to say a false sex positivity, it's not referred to that when asexuals encounter it. It's still referred to as sex positivity, which means it always has to be kind of questioned as such. And even though I would love to make distinctions between, the one that's liberatory and very much, beneficial for many queers and sexual individuals, and the one that asexuals find kind of repressive, as you heard examples of in my piece, I find that I'm kind of unable to do so. It's not as productive as I hoped, because they're still called by the same name, and so must be examined accordingly, because to asexuals, they feel the same in that way. So yes, absolutely, sex positivity can be fab, but it's just a matter of perspective.
Yeah, it strikes me that many people are trying to articulate sexuality and sex positivity from a capabilities perspective, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, that sex positivity is a capability, not a function. Still, though, that means an asexual has a capability that they then reject. And so it places the asexual in a different position from a consent-based sex positivity in that way than other people with other sexuality. So it's,
It's complicated further by gray sexualities as well, right?
Right.
Which is something that, given the scope of my paper, I didn't really have time to go into. But the very notion of folks who identify on kind of I wouldn't say a spectrum, because that implies like a binary, like moving from one to another in terms of scales of progressing towards this end or regressing towards this end in terms of asexual, sexual. But for gray sexual identities, like demisexuality, gray ace, it becomes more complicated because because choice, which is usually left out of the asexual, just plain asexual narrative, it's not a choice, this is who I am, becomes more, how can I say it? Difficult to discern, like more liminal, difficult to discern, I can't even speak, difficult to discern because of the notion of many folks maybe at once identifying as sexual, moving towards gray sexuality and asexuality, or identifying as asexual and then realizing they could actually have exceptions to that and identifying more with gray A because it allows them that space. So however you look at it and complicate it, it gets trickier with that notion. So.
Did I see one last person? I thought I saw somebody in the back, but I wasn't sure. Oh, sorry. Hi. Go ahead.
Can I come back to my question now? That you're speaking something. A friend, there's one homegirl who does, call me whatever, who does work on rape and consent, problematizing consent as problematic and assuming that once we get to understanding what the hell consent is, right, that both folks, if there's two individuals or more, can actually give consent, like there's power, right?
Yeah.
So like both can not only give but are willing to give consent. So that's part of it. And then also thinking, I don't know if this relates, but like thinking of then sexuality as compulsive, right? Like, oh, let's be sexual, right? Or something like that. I don't know. I'm still trying to formulate it.
That's okay. No, I appreciate that the notion of problematizing consent the way it stands, right? Because as it is often represented, it is, of course, the ideal to which sexual practices should aspire, at least how it's represented in sex-positive practice anyway. But as you, might have heard in the paper as well, that experience that one zine commenter, the contributor, we can only really say yes if we can safely say no. Like, consent is always problematized by power structures, as you mentioned, right? The hidden nature of that as well, because power is enacted between at an individual level, so it's difficult. Those conversations are being brought up more so, and especially in relation to intimate partner violence. And it's interesting you said that, because the last thing I wanted to say is that when I collaborated with another researcher, their research investigated, they just put out a call for people who had experienced queer intimate partner violence. And out of that just general call, 60% were asexual in that way. So maybe the ways in which consent is taken up, as a concept of power, as you mentioned, right? Maybe that is also kind of amplified within pressure from external sources as well, in terms of the asexual in sexual society, right?
And it sounds like you two need to spend some more time talking because you're doing similar work, which is the point of this conference. So walk up to people and ask them about their work and tell them about yours and see if you can find places for collaboration. So I want to thank, thank the panelists and wish you all a good day.
We also want, on behalf of qgrad, want to thank our moderator, Andrew Park, who's the International Programs Director in the Williams Institute and UCLA Law School. Thank you. So session 2 will start around 11:15, 11:20. 1 here and then 1 to 3:06. If y'all want to take a little coffee break or restroom break, yeah.